The morning of August 16th, 1945. In a makeshift interrogation room at Camp Tracy, California, Lieutenant Yoshi Nakamura sat across from an American naval intelligence officer named Captain James Mitchell. Nakamura had been pulled from the sea 3 weeks earlier when his destroyer, the Hamikaze, was torn apart by American aircraft off Okinawa. He had expected torture. He had expected death. What he had not expected was a printed document, 8 pages long, placed carefully on the table between them. It was a shipping manifest, American merchant vessels, tonnage calculations, construction timelines. Captain Mitchell slid the document forward and asked a simple question. "Lieutenant, based on your naval training, do these numbers seem possible to you?" Nakamura read the first page. His hands began to tremble. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The document detailed American merchant ship production for the year 1944 alone, over 8 million deadweight tons of advanced cargo vessels, victory ships, sea-type freighters, fast tankers capable of crossing the Pacific in 2 weeks. Nakamura looked up at Captain Mitchell with something approaching disbelief in his eyes. He spoke in halting English he had learned at the Naval Academy. "This cannot be true. No nation can build this." Captain Mitchell leaned back in his chair. He had conducted dozens of these interrogations since the summer. Japanese officers and enlisted men pulled from sinking ships, captured on bypassed islands, surrendering in ones and twos, as the reality of Japan's position became undeniable, and in almost every session, when confronted with evidence of American industrial capacity, the reaction was the same: disbelief. Then, a slow, creeping horror as the implications settled in. "Lieutenant," Mitchell said quietly, "those are just the advanced ships, the fast ones, the ones built to keep running after the war. We also built another 32 million tons of other vessels, liberty ships, tankers, troop transports. In 4 years, we built more merchant tonnage than the entire pre-war world merchant fleet combined." Nakamura set the document down. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "We were told America was a nation of shopkeepers, that you could not sustain a long war, that your people were soft." This was not an isolated moment. Across prisoner of war camps from Australia to California, in interrogation centers from Brisbane to Honolulu, Japanese military personnel were being confronted with a truth their high command had hidden from them, a truth so overwhelming that it explained, in a single devastating fact, why Japan had lost the war before it even truly began. America had not just outfought Japan. America had buried Japan under an avalanche of steel and machinery and organizational capability that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit, no amount of tactical brilliance, no amount of sacrifice could possibly overcome. The numbers were so staggering that even the American interrogators sometimes had trouble believing them. But they were true. Every single one of them. The story of how Japanese prisoners of war discovered the true scale of American shipping capacity is not just a tale of numbers and statistics. It is a story about the collision between propaganda and reality, between belief and evidence, between a military culture built on spiritual strength and an industrial system built on systematic mass production. It is a story about how wars are truly won and lost. To understand what these Japanese prisoners experienced, we must first understand what they had been taught to believe. The Empire of Japan in 1941 operated under a set of assumptions about warfare that had been shaped by decades of victory. Japan had defeated China in 1894. It had shocked the world by defeating Russia in 1905, the first time an Asian power had defeated a European one in modern warfare. The Japanese military had developed a doctrine centered on decisive battle, on moral and spiritual superiority, on the idea that a warrior nation with the right fighting spirit could overcome mere material advantages. This wasn't just propaganda. Japanese officers genuinely believed it. They had been trained at military academies where ancient samurai values were fused with modern tactical doctrine. They studied battles where outnumbered Japanese forces had triumphed through courage and sacrifice. When Japan looked at America in 1941, they saw a wealthy nation, certainly, but wealth, in their understanding, bred softness. Americans were portrayed in Japanese propaganda as individualistic, undisciplined, more interested in jazz music and Hollywood movies than in the harsh realities of war. The Japanese High Command calculated that America's industrial capacity was roughly 10 times greater than Japan's. But they truly believed, that this material disparity could be overcome by superior fighting spirit and by inflicting such devastating early defeats that America would lose the will to fight. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that devastating defeat. The sinking of the battleships, the destruction of aircraft, the psychological shock of a surprise attack, all of this was meant to convince America that challenging Japan in the Pacific was futile. Japanese military planners understood they could not win a long war of attrition. Their entire strategy hinged on winning quickly, on forcing America to accept Japan's conquests as a fait accompli. For young Japanese naval officers like Lieutenant Nakamura, the early months of the war seemed to confirm everything they had been taught. The Philippines fell, Singapore surrendered, the Dutch East Indies were conquered. American forces retreated across the Pacific. Japanese newspapers proclaimed victory after victory. The divine wind, they said, was blowing in Japan's favor. But there were officers, particularly in the Imperial Japanese Navy, who understood the true situation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard. He had seen the automobile factories in Detroit, the steel mills in Pittsburgh, the oil fields in Texas. He had tried to warn his superiors that America's industrial capacity was not just 10 times greater than Japan's, it was qualitatively different. Yamamoto had written in his private diary that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But after that, he had no confidence in victory. The problem was not American fighting spirit, though Yamamoto respected that too. The problem was American industrial organization, the ability to design, tool up, mass produce, and distribute war materials on a scale that Japan simply could not match. His warnings were noted, then largely ignored. The doctrine of decisive battle, of spiritual superiority, of Bushido overcoming material disadvantage, these ideas were too deeply embedded in Japanese military culture to be dislodged by mere statistics. And in the early months of the war, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, it seemed as though Yamamoto's pessimism was misplaced. The turning point came at Midway in June of 1942, but even that disaster could be rationalized. One bad day, bad luck, poor intelligence. The fighting spirit remained strong. But as 1942 turned into 1943, and 1943 turned into 1944, Japanese officers in the field began to notice something disturbing. Their supply lines were being strangled. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands were starving, not because they lacked fighting spirit, but because they lacked food. Japanese pilots were losing air battles not because they lacked courage, but because American factories were producing aircraft at rates that seemed impossible. And then there were the ships. Japanese naval officers, trained to track enemy fleet movements, began reporting observations that didn't make sense. American task forces that had been destroyed in one battle would reappear intact weeks later. New aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, escort carriers, appearing in numbers that exceeded Japan's entire pre-war construction capacity. How was this possible? The answer, which Japanese prisoners of war would discover in their interrogations, was American shipbuilding capacity. Between 1939 and 1945, the United States built nearly 40 million gross tons of merchant shipping. This was not a gradual build-up. This was an industrial explosion. At the peak of production in 1943 and 44, American shipyards were launching multiple cargo vessels every single day. To put this in perspective, the entire Japanese merchant marine in 1941 consisted of about 6 million tons of shipping. During the war, Japan managed to build an additional 4 million tons, bringing their total wartime merchant capacity to roughly 10 million tons. Of this, American submarines and aircraft would sink approximately 9 million tons, leaving Japan with barely 1.5 million tons at war's end. America, by contrast, started the war with about 12 million tons of merchant shipping, then proceeded to build 38 million more. The disparity was not just quantitative, it was categorical. It represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that Japanese military doctrine had no framework for understanding. The American approach was systematic, it was industrial, it was logistical. Where Japan emphasized the warrior spirit of individual soldiers, America emphasized the capacity of systems to support those soldiers. Where Japan celebrated tactical brilliance, America celebrated organizational efficiency. Where Japan honored death in battle, America honored productivity in factories. This difference in approach manifested most clearly in merchant shipping. Japan's merchant fleet was operated by traditional shipping companies, building traditional ships using traditional methods. Construction timelines were measured in years. Each vessel was a significant undertaking, requiring skilled labor and careful attention. America, faced with the need to build thousands of ships in a matter of years, did something revolutionary. They applied assembly line techniques, developed by Henry Ford for automobiles, to shipbuilding. They prefabricated components in inland factories, shipped them to coastal shipyards, and welded them together in a matter of weeks. At the peak of production, American shipyards were completing a Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, in an average of 42 days from keel laying to delivery. The record, set as a publicity stunt, was 4 days and 15 hours for the SS Robert E. Peary. Japanese naval architects, when they learned this figure in interrogation, initially refused to believe it. A ship, they insisted, required at least a year to build. The idea that America could build one in 4 days was beyond their comprehension. It violated everything they understood about shipbuilding. But it was true. And more than that, America wasn't just building quickly, they were building smartly. The early Liberty ships were basic cargo vessels, designed for wartime use only, slow but functional. But even as these ships were rolling off the assembly lines by the hundreds, American engineers were designing better vessels. The Victory ships, introduced in 1944, were faster, more efficient, and designed to remain useful after the war. The C-type ships, started before the war but expanded during it, were even more advanced 17-knot vessels with modern turbine engines, suitable for competitive commercial use. By war's end, America had built nearly 8 million tons of these advanced ships alone, on top of the 25 million tons of Liberty ships and 5 million tons of tankers. Lieutenant Nakamura, sitting in that interrogation room at Camp Tracy, was being forced to confront this reality. Captain Mitchell spread additional documents across the table. Shipping schedules, cargo manifests, port capacities, the systematic machinery of American logistics laid bare. "Do you understand what these numbers mean?" Mitchell asked. In 1944, American merchant ships carried over 78 million tons of cargo overseas. That's just cargo, not counting troops, not counting the ships themselves. 78 million tons. How much was the Imperial Japanese Navy able to transport in the same period? Nakamura did not answer. He couldn't. Japanese merchant capacity, by 1944, had collapsed to a fraction of its pre-war levels. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Critical supplies were not reaching frontline units. Soldiers were starving on islands that should have been well supplied. The entire Japanese war effort was choking on its own logistical failures. And here was America, producing cargo capacity at rates that seemed physically impossible, building ships faster than Japan could sink them, transporting supplies across distances that would have crippled Japanese logistics, maintaining army groups thousands of miles from home with a reliability that Japanese forces had never achieved even 100 miles from their bases. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners, when confronted with these facts, varied. Some refused to believe. They insisted the numbers were propaganda, exaggerations designed to break their morale. These men clung to what they had been taught, that material advantages meant nothing compared to Japanese warrior spirit. But many others, particularly more educated officers like Nakamura, experienced something approaching an existential crisis. They began to realize that they had been fighting a war they never had any realistic chance of winning. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, they had proven that courage in countless battles, but because the entire strategic foundation of Japanese war planning had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern industrial warfare actually worked. One prisoner, a former logistics officer captured in the Philippines, put it this way during his interrogation: "We were taught that spirit could overcome matter. But you, Americans, you made spirit irrelevant. You built so many ships, so many planes, so many tanks, that even if our soldiers destroyed 10 for every one of us killed, you would still win. This is not war. This is, I do not have the word, industrial murder." The interrogator recorded this statement in his report, noting that the prisoner was not being defiant or bitter. He was simply trying to articulate a realization that shattered his entire worldview. Everything he had been taught about warfare, about tactics, about the superiority of Japanese martial spirit, had been rendered obsolete by American industrial capacity. This was the true lesson that Japanese prisoners of war learned in American camps. Not that they had lost because they lacked courage, not that they had lost because of poor tactics or inadequate training. They had lost because they were fighting an enemy that had weaponized industrial production in a way that no nation in human history had ever done before. The numbers Captain Mitchell shared with Lieutenant Nakamura that morning told only part of the story. Yes, America had built 40 million tons of shipping, but behind those numbers was an entire system: the shipyards, the steel mills feeding those shipyards, the coal mines feeding those steel mills, the railroads, moving materials from mines to mills to shipyards. The workers, hundreds of thousands of them, including women and minorities who had never worked in heavy industry before. And beyond even that was the organizational capability to plan and coordinate all of this, to know how many ships would be needed, where they would be needed, when they would be needed, to design standardized vessels that could be built quickly, to train workers who had never built ships before, to solve technical problems like the brittle steel fractures that plagued early Liberty ships, and implement solutions across dozens of shipyards simultaneously. This was not just industrial capacity, this was systems thinking. It was management theory applied to warfare. It was the kind of capability that emerges not from military academies teaching ancient warrior codes, but from business schools teaching efficiency and optimization. And it was something Japan, for all its tactical prowess, had never developed. In camp libraries at prisoner-of-war facilities, Japanese officers who spoke English began reading American magazines and newspapers. They read about the shipyards, about the workers, about the organizational structures that made mass production possible. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand how completely they had misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. One officer wrote in a letter, later intercepted by camp censors, "I see now why Yamamoto-sama was so troubled. He saw this. He knew. And we did not listen. We thought ships were built one at a time by craftsmen. We did not know they could be manufactured like automobiles. We thought warfare was about the spirit of the warrior. We did not know it had become about the efficiency of the factory." The 8 million tons of advanced C-type and Victory ships represented something even more troubling to Japanese prisoners who understood shipping. These were not wartime emergency vessels. These were sophisticated merchant ships, designed for the post-war era. America was not just building enough capacity to win the current war. They were building capacity to dominate global shipping for decades to come. Part 2 of the script. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The interrogation sessions at Camp Tracy, California, and similar facilities across the Pacific Theater followed a pattern. American intelligence officers, many of them Japanese-speaking Nisei who had been recruited for their language skills, would begin with basic questions. Name, rank, unit, assignment, standard military information. But then the questions would shift. How much cargo could your unit receive per month? What were your ration levels? When did supply deliveries stop being regular? Japanese prisoners, conditioned by their military culture to believe that surrender meant they had lost all honor, often answered these questions freely. They felt they had nothing left to lose. Many actually appreciated the opportunity to speak with someone who understood Japanese culture and military terminology. The food was better than anything they'd eaten in months. The medical care was vastly superior to what Japanese military medicine could provide, and slowly, through these conversations, a picture emerged. That picture was of a military force that had been logistically strangled, not defeated in decisive battle, but gradually worn down by the systematic collapse of its supply network. Japanese combat units in the Pacific, by 1944, were receiving perhaps 1/10 of the supplies they needed. Ammunition was rationed. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Men were dying not from American weapons, but from malnutrition, disease, and infected wounds that should have been treatable. At the Omori prison camp near Tokyo, liberated in September 1945, American forces discovered Japanese records that detailed the scope of the supply crisis. One document, a logistics report from the Southern Army Command, dated March 1944, stated bluntly that merchant shipping losses had made it impossible to maintain more than 30% of required supply deliveries to forward units. Another document, from the Imperial Japanese Navy's Logistics Division, calculated that by January 1945, Japan's remaining merchant fleet could transport approximately 1 million tons of cargo per month. The actual requirement for military operations alone was estimated at 7 million tons per month. The gap was unbridgeable. When American interrogators showed these captured documents to Japanese prisoners who had served in logistics roles, the reactions were telling. Some broke down entirely. They had known supplies were short, but they had believed it was temporary, a problem that would be solved once Japan won its decisive victory. The documents proved it was systemic, irreversible. A former quartermaster officer from the 14th Army in the Philippines, interrogated at Camp Tracy in October 1945, provided particularly valuable intelligence. Captain Hiroaki Saito had been responsible for supply distribution across Luzon. He had surrendered when his position was overrun during the American liberation of Manila, expecting immediate execution. Instead, he found himself in California, being asked detailed questions about Japanese logistics. Captain Saito explained the reality of Japanese supply operations. Ships carrying critical supplies would depart from Japan or Formosa, but fewer than half would reach their destinations. American submarines hunted them relentlessly. Those ships that survived the submarine gauntlet then faced American air power as they approached their ports. Even ships that successfully unloaded were often hit at dock, destroying the supplies before they could be distributed. But the interrogation took a different turn when the American officer, a Navy commander named Robert Chen, asked Saito about his understanding of American logistics. Saito admitted he had believed American forces faced similar supply challenges. The distances were vast. The ocean was hostile. Surely the Americans struggled to maintain their armies so far from home. Commander Chen nodded, then produced a series of photographs. They showed Tacloban Harbor in the Philippines, Shortly after the American invasion of Leyte in October 1944, the harbour was filled with ships, liberty ships, victory ships, tankers, landing craft, supply vessels of every description. They stretched to the horizon. "Captain Saito," Chen said, "this is one harbour, one operation." At the time this photograph was taken, similar scenes were playing out at Hollandia, at Ulithi, at Pearl Harbor, at dozens of other locations across the Pacific. "How many ships do you count in this photograph?" Saito studied the 12th image carefully. He counted 57 vessels visible in the frame. Chen nodded. This photograph represents perhaps 5% of American merchant shipping operating in the Pacific Theater at that time. We had over 1,000 merchant vessels assigned to Pacific operations alone. Another several hundred supported operations in Europe. This is in addition to our naval vessels. The numbers were incomprehensible to Saito. The entire Japanese merchant marine, before the war, had numbered fewer than 6 million tons. Even if every single Japanese merchant ship had been assigned to a single harbour, it would not have matched what this photograph showed America deploying to one medium-sized operation. Chen continued. "You mentioned that Japanese forces on Luzon were receiving approximately 30% of required supplies by early 1945. At that same time, American forces in the Philippines were receiving 110% of their requirements. We deliberately overstocked. Every American soldier received 3 hot meals per day, full ammunition loads, complete medical support, fresh uniforms, mail from home delivered weekly, Coca-Cola, ice cream." This last detail caused Saito visible distress. Ice cream. While Japanese soldiers starved on jungle roots and whatever they could forage, American soldiers were being supplied with ice cream. The disparity was so vast it bordered on the surreal. Chen explained further. The United States Navy had actually commissioned specialized refrigeration ships specifically to produce ice cream for troops in the Pacific. These vessels would visit fleet anchorages and island bases, producing and distributing hundreds of gallons of ice cream. To American commanders, maintaining troop morale was a logistical priority worth dedicating shipping to. A Japanese commander, hearing about American ice cream ships through intercepted communications, had supposedly remarked that this single detail told him everything about why Japan would lose the war. While Japan was desperately trying to move ammunition and food to starving garrisons, America had surplus shipping capacity to dedicate to ice cream. The war was already over. Japan simply hadn't admitted it yet. But the true revelation for Japanese prisoners came when they learned not just the scale of American shipping, but the systematic nature of it. This was not merely about building ships. It was about creating an entire logistics architecture that could support global operations indefinitely. American interrogators sometimes used visual aids to help Japanese prisoners understand. Maps showing shipping routes, charts displaying tonnage moved per month, organizational diagrams of the War Shipping Administration. For Japanese officers trained in traditional military planning, these materials revealed a completely different philosophy of warfare. One such briefing took place at Fort Hunt, Virginia, where high-ranking Japanese prisoners were brought for detailed interrogation. A captured Rear Admiral, Takeo Kurita, not the famous Vice Admiral Kurita who commanded at Leyte Gulf, but a logistics specialist with the same surname, was shown a comprehensive briefing on American merchant ship operations. The briefing detailed the convoy system, how ships were organized, routed, protected. It showed the coordination between the War Shipping Administration, the Navy, and the Army. It explained how cargo priorities were established, how ships were allocated, how ports were managed. It was a masterclass in systematic logistics. Admiral Kurita, who had spent his career in naval logistics, was stunned by the level of organization. The Japanese system, he explained, was much more ad hoc. Ships were assigned to missions based on availability. Routing was often determined by individual ship captains. Coordination between services was minimal. There was no equivalent to the War Shipping Administration. no centralized authority, managing the entire merchant fleet as a strategic resource. "You treat your merchant ships like pieces on a game board," Kurita said through a translator, "moving them systematically to achieve strategic goals. We treated ours like individual businesses. Each ship owner operated independently. The Navy could requisition vessels, but there was no overall system, no central planning." The interrogator, an army colonel who had worked in shipping before the war, nodded. "Admiral, I'm going to tell you something that I think will interest you. Before the war, our merchant marine was very similar to what you describe. Small companies, independent operations, no central coordination. We were actually quite inefficient by world standards. But when the war started, we created the War Shipping Administration. We essentially nationalized the merchant marine, not through seizure, but through systematic coordination. Private companies still operated the ships, but under WSA control, we standardized designs, standardized training, standardized operations. We turned merchant shipping from a collection of independent businesses into a strategic weapon." Kurita asked the obvious question. "How long did this transformation take?" 18 months. By mid-1943, we had a fully integrated global logistics system. That's when our offensive operations really accelerated, not because we suddenly got better at fighting, but because we could finally supply our forces properly. This was the lesson that cut deepest for Japanese prisoners who understood logistics. Japan had spent the entire war trying to fight with an improvised supply system. America had spent the first year of the war building a systematic one, then used it to crush Japan methodically. The human cost of this logistical disparity became clear through prisoner testimonies. At interrogation centers, Japanese soldiers described conditions on bypassed islands. On New Georgia, on Bougainville, on dozens of other islands, Japanese garrisons had been cut off and left to starve, not because American forces couldn't defeat them in battle, but because it was more efficient to bypass them, cut their supply lines, and let logistics do the work. A private first class named Kenji Tanaka, captured on New Britain in early 1945, described his unit's final months. They had received no supplies for 7 months. Men were dying daily from malnutrition. They ate bark, roots, insects, anything to stay alive. When he was captured, Tanaka weighed 78 pounds. He had weighed 150 pounds when his unit was first deployed to New Britain 2 years earlier. The American medics who treated Tanaka gave him small amounts of food, gradually increasing his intake to avoid refeeding syndrome. Within 2 weeks, he had gained 15 pounds. Within a month, he weighed 110 pounds. The American medical system had salvaged him from the brink of death with a systematic approach to nutrition and care that Japanese military medicine could never have provided. Tanaka asked his interrogator a question. Why had the Americans saved him? He was the enemy. He had expected to be killed, or at best, imprisoned and neglected. Instead, he had been given medical care that exceeded what he would have received in a Japanese military hospital even before the war. The interrogator, a young lieutenant named David Wong, explained it simply. "It's in our interest to keep you healthy. Sick prisoners require more resources to manage. Dead prisoners provide no intelligence. Healthy prisoners can be put to work, can be interrogated more effectively, and frankly, treating you properly is just the right thing to do." This answer confused Tanaka. The concept of treating enemy prisoners well, because it was the right thing to do, was foreign to his understanding. In Japanese military culture, prisoners had brought shame upon themselves by surrendering. They deserved no consideration. Yet here were Americans, expending significant medical resources on enemy soldiers for no apparent strategic benefit beyond basic humanitarian concern. The systematic nature of American prisoner care was itself a form of logistical demonstration. The camps were organized efficiently. Food was adequate. Medical care was provided. Prisoners could write letters home, though few did, believing their families would be shamed by their survival. The Americans maintained detailed records of every prisoner, tracked their health, their interrogations, their work assignments. For Japanese prisoners from rural backgrounds, who had never seen industrial organization, this systematic approach was bewildering. Everything was documented, scheduled, planned. Nothing was left to chance or individual initiative. The American military operated like a vast machine, with each part functioning according to established procedures. But for educated Japanese officers, particularly those with technical or logistics training, the systematic nature of American operations was revelatory. They began to understand that they had been fighting a war using a fundamentally different philosophy. Japan emphasized flexibility, individual initiative, tactical brilliance. America emphasized standardization, systematic planning, overwhelming material superiority. Neither approach was inherently superior in the abstract, but in the context of industrial warfare, where victory depended on mobilizing and sustaining massive forces across global distances, the American approach had proven devastatingly effective. The shipping numbers told the story most clearly. By the end of 1944, when Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to perhaps 2 million tons of operational capacity, America was operating nearly 60 million tons. The disparity was 30 to 1. Even if Japanese submarines and aircraft had been able to sink American merchant ships at rates equivalent to what American forces achieved against Japanese shipping, which they could not, it would have taken decades to significantly impact American logistics. Some Japanese prisoners, when confronted with these numbers, argued that they were irrelevant. Japan had lost because of American code-breaking, or air superiority, or tactical errors like Midway. These factors had decided the war, not merchant shipping. The interrogators would patiently explain that every one of those factors depended on logistics. American code-breaking required specialized equipment, trained personnel, communication infrastructure, all of which had to be transported and sustained across the Pacific. American air superiority depended on aircraft production, but also on the ability to transport those aircraft, along with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained pilots, to forward bases. Tactical decisions at battles like Midway were important, but the reason America could replace losses from Midway while Japan could not was fundamentally logistical. One interrogation, conducted in November 1945 at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, captured this realization perfectly. A former staff officer from Imperial General Headquarters, Colonel Masao Yoshida, had been involved in strategic planning throughout the war. He had access to intelligence reports, production figures, casualty estimates. He had seen the data. The American interrogator asked him when he had realized Japan would lose the war. Yoshida thought carefully before answering. The moment I saw the shipping loss figures for 1943, we had lost 3 million tons that year. We built less than 1 million tons. The mathematics were simple. Within 2 years, we would have insufficient shipping to feed our own population, much less sustain military operations. And yet, the interrogator prompted. The war continued for another 2 years after that. Yoshida nodded slowly. Yes, because accepting defeat was impossible. We had been taught that surrender was the ultimate shame, better to fight to the last man than to admit failure. So we continued, knowing we could not win, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in battles we knew were futile. This confession, buried in interrogation transcripts at the National Archives, revealed the terrible tragedy of the Pacific War's final years. Japan's military and civilian leadership understood by late 1943 that victory was impossible. The shipping crisis alone made that clear. But the same cultural factors that made Japanese soldiers fight so tenaciously also made it politically impossible to seek peace. The shipping statistics became a kind of proof, mathematical evidence of inevitable defeat that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. American interrogators found that showing Japanese prisoners these numbers was often more effective than any other interrogation technique. The numbers could not be denied. They could not be rationalized away. They represented an objective reality that forced prisoners to confront the futility of continued resistance. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the shipping disparity had become almost comical in its extremity. Japan had approximately 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping remaining, most of it damaged or unseaworthy. America had 60 million tons, with production facilities capable of building millions more. If the war had continued, America could have maintained military operations indefinitely. Japan was, quite literally, starving. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.